All right, we're gonna do some really simple but beautiful cherry blossoms. So I want to start with a kind of like a light sky blue green background. And I'm gonna be using a medium or like a 1 inch wash or 1 inch flat brush is gonna work good for this. And I'm gonna actually start with my lighter colors in the middle, and then I'm gonna put some darker colors around the edges. So I'm gonna use blue and a lot of white with a little bit of yellow. So it shouldn't look green, it should look kind of turquoise. That's what we're going for. And then I want to put that in the middle. Maybe just like all through here, kind of like that. Totally fine. And then maybe add a little more white if it's too light. And I'm just kind of rubbing it in really gently. I don't want to spend too much time on this. I just want to get that lighter color through the middle. And then as I pull to the edges, I'll add more blue and maybe just a little bit of green or a little bit of yellow to make it somewhat green, but it should still look kind of bluish. Trying to go for like a turquoise. And then I'm just going around the edges, and notice how I'm just dabbing that in and rubbing. And then I can always go back and add more white to help with the transition between the darker shade and the lighter shade. And then you kind of get a third shade. So I always kind of grab a little bit of white on my brush and then come in to help with the transitions. White, especially if you're moving from this like lighter color with more white in it and your paint is still wet, it's really easy to do that. Where I find people run into issues with blending is more that they're going really slow and their paint is drying really fast and they're just unable to get those colors to blend. So that's just the way acrylic paint is, though. I mean, it just dries fast. So you kind of have to adapt to that. It's frustrating for some people who are like more my savory people that want to really just go a little slower, and that's okay. But the paint, what am I saying? The acrylic paint doesn't really care how you feel about it. It's just going to dry anyway. So you got to know what you're working with, and then you can adjust. There's things you could use, like products that help the paint dry slower, or specific kinds of paint that are like slow drying acrylics. And that might be actually a good solution for some people. Or my favorite solution is to just paint faster, just bust it out. Because a lot of times those people tend to be also over analyzing it and trying to plan it out a little too much. And it might benefit you to just, let go a little bit. It doesn't have to be perfect. And you really don't need to think about it too hard. It's just a painting, so we're just expressing, having fun with it. Make sure that's your prime directive here. Right. So I've got some different shades. I want there to be some parts that look pretty dark though. So if I use a little extra blue and basically have like almost no white, I can really make sure to get some dark areas, especially in like the lower right corner, maybe like through this area right here and the upper right. Just kind of make sure you've got some dark parts. It's going to be helpful. And then we can do a little bit of a bokeh effect. So if you want to blend your paint out a little more, I'm just going to do a little bit more blending before I add this next effect, but I don't want my paint to get dry. But if you have like a lot of paint on your brush, on your palette, sometimes I know a lot of people use a lot of paint. Sometimes you could just use a dry brush, so clean and dry your brush, kind of Bob Ross style. And you can just like dab or feather. I would more like do a little circular motion for this one. And what it's going to do is going to just pick up some of that excess paint that looks maybe a little clunky and help with the blending as well. So maybe just one last little kind of touch up there before we go on to the next step. So next step is going to be mostly just with the fingers. Now you could use a brush, like a round brush or something, to do this as well. If you use a round brush, I would just use, you know, like a smallish one because I'm working on a small canvas, but I would use the white by itself. And then you can make little circles like this. And this is going to give us a little starting point. But then I always like to blur it out more with my finger so that you don't get like this clunky look. So sometimes people want to go in and do this with like a paintbrush or even a sponge. And it's not wrong, but it won't be as subtle. So I just find it easier to do it with the finger. So you just got to find what works for you. And just wipe your finger if it gets really painterly. And I'm going to do this for a minute on the background. Now your paint won't, notice I'm just doing a couple little, like I want one here. My paint is really wet, so I can do this. But a lot of times I'll just do one at a time because I don't want it to dry too fast. But I'm not worried about that with this one. Probably not going to happen. But I want to get some different sizes. So you don't want them all to be the same size. Maybe have some little itty bitty ones that are like a little smaller. So then just start out with less paint. That way you can still blur it out without making the circle too big. So just use a little bit at a time. Again, I can either just tap my finger in there or you can use the brush or both. But I might want some that are like really big. Like on my 8x10, that's like the size of a ping pong ball. So maybe some are a little bit bigger in that regard. Want some to be pretty big. And then add some medium and some small. So get at least 3 different sizes and they can overlap. You can just zone out and do this for a little while. You can even like pause it, turn on some music. I am just zoning out doing this because it's so much fun if you don't rush this process. Just to get as many in there as you can while you're having fun with it. Just a dabbing and a rubbing. And if you're not getting like this kind of look, you probably have maybe a couple things going on. Too much paint, your paint's too dry, your paint's too thick. Sometimes it's like you just have to find the relationship with the art supplies that you're using. So like maybe you are using a really, if you're using the paint I recommend, it should be good. But again, everyone's different. You can always add a little bit of water into your paint to make it go on a little smoother. Because a lot of times that has is playing a factor. It's just the paint is kind of too dry for this, or the background is like too dry already. So then you have to wet your paint a little more to get it to rub on in this kind of really transparent kind of way where it's blending with the background color and creating this blurred look. But notice I did like one big one and then I did another smaller one, like overlapping on it a little bit. You want to get that in there too, because that's just going to make it look a little more natural and interesting. I'm just doing little bits at a time, little bits. And now it's mine looks pretty dry through the middle. I'm gonna add another little one right here. But my edges where it got it like really darker is still kind of wet. And that's fine. It doesn't need to be 100% dry to move on to adding our branch. So for our branch, I recommend either a really fine pointed tipped round brush or a square brush. Now, if I were using a bigger canvas, I would use a square brush because it's going to be able to hold more paint and the brush stroke will be able to go further. But since we're using a kind of a smallish canvas, you don't really need to go as far. So I could use a round brush, no problem. It really just always depends on what you're working with and what you're trying to achieve. So I don't always do the same things depending on the painting. I just dripped a little bit of water on that. So I'm just going to go ahead and make that part of my design. So what we're going to do is make some brown, but I want it to be like a dark, dark, dark brown. So use your small round brush and get some yellow and red mixed together, and then just gradually add a tiny bit of black at a time until you get a dark brown. Now I'm going to add just a little more red and yellow back because it got really, really dark. But I do want it pretty dark, so I'm using a lot of black. Might even look black on camera, but it has a slight warm brown, like dark brown undertone, so I'm good. Now what I'm going to do is find the middle, so you know where the middle is. You can go top and bottom and then move your fingers together at the same speed. Just go, okay, there's the middle. And then what I'm going to do is come from the top. I'm going to pull a line from the top left through the center and then just kind of meandering down. And then maybe I have another branch coming here and another one coming up over here. So you have a couple branches. This one can kind of, meander off into a Y shape. So see how it looks like a Y at the end? Not a literal Y, but just like the shape. And then you're going to pull little brush strokes off. And I want the little ones to be even darker, so you can even add more black to your brush. But see how I can pull like these little wiggly kind of creep in branches at the tips. You're just barely touching. So if you're practicing getting lines, you want to make sure you have your paint just at the tip. It's not like bunched up at the ferrule where the metal and the bristle come together. That's what the ferrule is called. So if you have a bunch of paint gathering up right there, it's going to mess up the tip. It's going to make the tip puff out. So a lot of times with a round brush, I'll swirl the brush like that, like especially to get the excess paint off, just kind of spin it and then make sure it's just on the tip. And then that helps reshape it too. And then I can have all sorts of fun little branches coming off this big design that we're doing. So I'm just barely touching. Let the brush wiggle. So I'm going to keep going through here and just adding. And another thing is you want to just make sure that some of the branches are thicker, all the branches should be thicker at the base. And what I mean by thicker at the base is that they move from thicker to thinner. So if you check your little branches, notice how this branch is kind of the same size throughout. I like to add a little extra thickness right there. It does make it look a little bit better. Now, you don't have to worry too much about it for the super small ones, but for the bigger ones, it's going to be more noticeable. So like, for example, this coming out right here, I want that to be thicker, like at the base, because this is our biggest branch too. And you can really thicken it up if you need to. But see, I just thickened up the little area where the branches come together. So that's going to help with making your branches look more natural too. So if you make sure to check that, you're going to get a better result. And I mean, you don't have to take it too far. It can be a little more stylized. Don't let it stress you out, but it's something to consider and play with. And sometimes I get a little carried away with these branches because they're just so fun to paint. You can really have them going off and really filling up the space. And this is going to create a nice foundation for us to add the blossoms. Some of them can be bigger, some can be smaller. So you're really just, and let them be kind of wiggly. That's another good thing to use a round brush for. So it's a little easier to get like these really gnarly looking lines with a round brush. But some people really, sometimes I just favor a square brush. So if you want to try different brushes, go for it. You really have to go with what is making the process just funner for you and what's getting it where you want it to go the best, whatever that may be. So you got to know that about yourself. That's one thing I love about art is it's so individual. So what might be really fun and work well for me um, might not be fun or work well for you. So you got to know. And part of figuring that out, if you don't know yet, is just trying different things. And the more different things you try, the more information you have to go off of there. And then you'll figure it out. Now, for the blossoms, you could use like a filbert, which is fun. It's just a rounded top. These are really cheap brushes. Like if you wanted to use those, you could. I don't really use those very much. I prefer a little bit of a nicer brush. So these are like the Princeton brushes. I'm going to use a filbert, and this is a number 8, which it's almost like more like a number 4. They're all different. And then what I'm going to do is just map out where my biggest blossoms are going to go, and I'm going to paint them with like almost like white, but with just a tiny bit of red. So just a little bit of red and a lot of white. It's a very light pink, but it should still show up as pink. Like you want to see like a difference between the white and the color that you're making. So, add enough to make it look noticeable. And then I'm going to make sure to put one cherry blossom in the middle. I want that to be one of my bigger ones. So I'm going to make a little dot. And then maybe I have one on this branch up at the top. Maybe I have one down here, one down here, one up a little higher in this branch. And then that's it. I want those to be my biggest ones. And since they're going to be my biggest ones, and I want them to be like rounded leaves. So I'm going to go around in a circle, just use the top of the brush to help shape the blossom. And I want there to be like minimum 5. If you can squeeze in 6, that's fine. But you don't want like 4. Try to have 5 or more. And I'm going to have this one be pretty big. So you can make some of them look a little bigger. And it just makes it easier using the filbert because it's already shaped like the petal. So it just makes the work less work for you. And then once you have those, you can use the round to create some different size ones. So let me go back to using this other one. So I'm using like a round brush here, and I want to go in and make some smaller ones. So it's the same thing, but I'm going to use the small round brush to create a smaller one. So you can go in, and I still want them to be like rounded at the tips. So just push and kind of wiggle to create a circle at the end. Same thing, but smaller. And they might look, a little less detailed, which is fine because that's what happens when you have smaller things. And then you can also just have little buds coming at the end. So maybe I just have some little taps of those. And they can just be sort of scattering around too, like floating in the sky. It doesn't have to be necessarily attached to the branch. So I'm just going to have some floating around because I think it looks fun. Beautiful. And now next we're going to add some darker color towards the center. And what I'm going to do is use mostly red with a little bit of white and a tiny bit of blue. And add a little bit more red, actually. I don't want it to be too purpley. It should be more pinkish, but we're just going to make it a little bit darker by adding a little bit of blue to it. And then this is going to go in the middle. So you're just going to reapply a little dot to the center. And this is just to the ones that are open. So I'm not doing that to just the little dot type things. That would work really well. And then we're just going to feather out a little bit. If you want to get more precision, you could use a super tiny brush. I'm going to add a little more red to it because I feel like mine's like a little bit too purpley. And then you're just going to pull a little bit out from the middle. So I'm pulling from the center out into the leaf or the petal just a little bit. Not too much. And this is such a simple, we're doing a very simple version of cherry blossoms. I have a much more detailed one in my beginner acrylic course. if you enjoy this, you might enjoy that. It's going to go a little bit, like, do some different techniques that are going to make it a little bit more elevated. This is a really fun practicing starting point. So notice how I've got that, and maybe I want to add a little bit of that darker color just around, floating in the sky, or adding some dimension to the lighter petals, especially towards the center, because these darker petals are going to stand out more in the middle where it's really bright. So maybe we want some of those just falling in the sky in those spaces. It's just fun to add that. You don't have to, but it just gives it a little bit of movement. And then I'm going to go ahead and clean it. And then we're just going to add black to the center. If you want it to look a little toned down, you could add a little bit of red into the black. Add a little bit of red into the black. And then I'm just going to add a dot of black towards the center. So you should still be able to see that darker color that we put in the middle, but we're adding just a dot on top of that. And then while we let that dry a little bit, let's add some highlights to our branch. So these are going to dry for just a second, and then I'm going to go ahead and take this like a small square brush, that whatever works for you. We're going to go to our brown color and add some white to it. Maybe add the pink into it too. And then I'm going to take that to the top of the branch. So like up right here, you're just going to graze a little bit of that color towards the top. And I'm going to do that everywhere. Just use the edge of that brush. And it really doesn't matter what side of the branch it's on. I try to put my highlight on the side wherever there's the more light in the picture. Again, you can add some of that pink into that brownish color because that could look nice. And add more white if you want it to stand out more. And then to add a few finishing touches, we want to have some highlights. So clean your small round brush, whichever size works good for you. Just as long as you have a good point on it, it's going to work well. And I'm going to use pure white. Now the pure white is going to go on the outer edges of the blossoms, just almost like outlined, but you can kind of dab or feather the white in a little bit. So it still looks pink, but it has a glow on the tips. And you can add some of this into the background too, like little dots maybe. Just tap or poke the canvas with these white dots. But I'm going to do this to all the leaves, just put a little extra white around the edge. Don't cover the light pink all the way. Some cherry blossoms are like really light colored. And that's what I'm going for with this one. I want these really baby pink ones. I just like the way those ones look. So just imagine you're like outlining the edges and then maybe brushing it in towards the center a little bit without covering your pink all the way. So be careful not to do that. And if you do, it's okay. You can always go back and add more pink, but see how they kind of pop out more? And then don't forget about your, like the leaves. So you can always add a little highlight or a little pop of white to some of those um, blossom buds. So those little dabs, the ones that aren't like fully blooming. And again, you could just add some dots into the sky as well, just tapping little dots. It just gives it a little more fun interest into the look of the whole thing. You can even add more highlights to the blossom. Like I'm going to go in, maybe add some of that light pink, maybe make it a little lighter. So it's like the first color we use for the blossom. And you can use that to highlight your branch even more. So if you got that like brownish color, maybe you want to add another little dash of highlight. Try to get at least 3 shades showing, dark, medium, and light. Doesn't really matter what colors you use. And then last but not least, let's add some little dots on the inside of the dark center. So I'm going to use the tip of the brush with the white, and then I'm going to go into the center. So find the center of your flower, and then just take the white. Notice how I have kind of a lot on there, and you're just going to poke a bunch of little pokies. Not so many that you like cover the dark part all the way, but just add to it. And I'm going to do that to all of them.